There's a museum in central France, in a city called Clermont-Ferrand, where a single painting has quietly built a reputation far beyond its walls. Visitors stop in front of it and go silent. Some cry, some argue about what they're looking at, and almost none of them agree on what actually happened in the scene. The painting has no easy title in English. In French, it's called Les Saltimbanques, a word that once referred to traveling street performers, the kind who worked without a fixed stage or a fixed home. Today, it also circulates under two other names, the Acrobats and, more bluntly, the Wounded Child. Whatever you call it, the effect is the same. You look at it once, and you find yourself looking again. A circus, a family, a catastrophe. The composition is deceptively simple. A woman, in a deep blue dress, sits with a young boy across her lap. Her head bends down toward his, forehead nearly touching his hair. He isn't moving. A cloth wrapped around his skull has darkened with blood to the side. At a slight remove from the two of them, a man in performer's dress sits with his own head lowered, whitened face, the diamond patterns of a harlequin costume. He isn't rushing toward them. He isn't reaching out. He's simply there, present but apart, as though something has already been decided and there's nothing left for him to do. Scattered near the woman's feet, playing cards, tossed or dropped, one of them recognizable as the ace of spades. Beside her, tethered by a chain, an owl. Two dogs, dressed in small costumes of their own, linger at the edges, one straining toward the child, the other simply still. Further back, barely lit, a handful of onlookers watch from the shadow. Doré built this scene with light, the way a stage director might. The mother and child sit inside a pool of brightness, almost lifted out of the rest of the canvas, while everything else, the harlequin, the animals, the crowd, recedes into a kind of gloom. Art historians who've studied the piece note that a diagonal line, cutting from the upper corner down through the composition, effectively splits the painting into two moods: the lit half holding tenderness, the shadowed half holding distance and unease. Poe was the man who painted this. To understand why this canvas feels so different from most of what hung in French salons in the 1870s, it helps to know what Gustave Doré actually spent his career doing. Doré was, first and foremost, an illustrator, arguably the most prolific and successful one Europe had seen. Long before this painting existed, his engravings had already put images in the minds of readers across the continent, and in America, the terraced circles of Dante's Inferno, Cervantes' Night tilting at windmills, entire chapters of the Bible, rendered in dense, dramatic black and white. If you've ever seen a 19th century edition of any of these texts, there's a fair chance Doré's hand shaped how you pictured them. Whether you knew his name or not, painting, though, was a different story. Critics of the period tended to treat Doré's canvases with a kind of polite dismissal. Too theatrical, they said, too dependent on storytelling, rather than the formal concerns painting was supposed to have. He wanted to be taken seriously as a painter, and by most accounts, never quite managed it in his lifetime. What's notable is what he chose to paint anyway. Not the mythological or biblical grandeur his engravings were famous for, but performers, wanderers, the people who made a living on the margins of respectable society. He seems to have been genuinely drawn to that world, its noise, its spectacle, and also its precariousness. Les Saltimbanques, finished in 1874, sits right at the center of that interest. What Doré actually said about it here's where the story stops being a matter of pure speculation. In an interview published the same year he completed the painting, Doré was asked directly about the wounded child and whether the boy would survive. According to the record of that conversation, Doré's answer was blunt: the child was dying. He described the parents as people who had, in effect, sacrificed their son for money and who only discovered they had any capacity for feeling once the damage was done. That's about as close as we get to the artist's own intention. He apparently considered giving the work a French title along the lines of Agony, and reportedly resisted an English engraver's suggestion to call it something softer, more theatrical, behind the scenes. So the broad outline isn't really in dispute. This is a painting about a family of circus performers and a child injured, likely fatally, during an act. Some later writers have connected the scene to an actual newspaper account of a similar accident, one Doré may have read around that time, though this detail rests more on tradition than on any document anyone has been able to produce. What remains genuinely open is everything underneath that outline. And that's where the painting starts asking questions it never answers, raiding the symbols. Take the woman's blue dress. Blue in European religious painting had been the color of the Virgin Mary for centuries, a visual shorthand any 19th century viewer would have recognized instantly. Combine that with her posture, cradling a wounded child whose limp weight and closed eyes recall countless paintings of the Deposition or the Pietà, and the religious echo becomes hard to ignore. Doré himself, in that same period interview, apparently acknowledged the commission, noting the painting would have made an interesting counterpoint to his large canvas of Christian martyrs. That's not confirmation that he intended a full religious allegory, but it tells us the parallel wasn't lost on him either. Then there's the harlequin, positioned apart from mother and child. Some observers have pointed to an old compositional habit in nativity scenes, where Joseph is often placed slightly outside the central grouping of Mary and the infant, present but not quite part of the sacred core. If Doré was borrowing that arrangement, it would explain why the father figure here feels so oddly detached, watching rather than intervening. The objects at ground level invite their own reading, though none of it is settled. The Ace of Spades has carried associations with death or bad fortune in different card traditions, which makes its placement directly at the mother's foot feel less like an accident of composition and more like a deliberate note. The owl, chained rather than free, resists a single meaning: wisdom in some traditions, misfortune in others. But chaining a symbol usually associated with insight does suggest something about judgment failed or ignored. The costumed dogs blur the line between performance and mourning. Are they still in character, or have they too stopped performing? None of these details come with a caption. Doré left behind no written key to his own symbolism, which is exactly why generations of viewers have felt free to supply their own. The internet finds a painting. For most of the 20th century, Les Saltimbanques lived a relatively quiet life inside its museum in Clermont-Ferrand, known mainly to specialists in French 19th century art. Its second act came from somewhere Doré could never have anticipated: image-sharing platforms. Once high-resolution photographs of the painting started circulating on Reddit threads, Tumblr blogs, and Instagram art accounts, a very old painting suddenly had a very modern audience, one that came to it with no prior context, just an image and a caption. And the debates that followed weren't really debates among art historians. They were amateur readings, tarot enthusiasts flagging the Ace of Spades, animal lovers puzzling over the dogs, religious viewers spotting the Marian blue, true crime-minded commenters treating it almost like a cold case. That's a strange kind of afterlife for a 19th century salon painting, to become, more than a century after it was finished, the subject of comment section arguments about what actually happened to the boy, a second, quieter version adding to the puzzle. Doré appears to have painted more than one version of this scene. A related composition exists that strips away much of the surrounding detail. No owl, no dogs, no scattered cards, leaving, essentially, the woman, the child, and the harlequin figure alone. In that version, without the supporting cast of symbolic objects, the harlequin reads less like a specific character and more like an abstraction, guilt itself, perhaps, sitting and watching. Whether Doré made this simpler version as a preliminary study, a private reworking, or a deliberate alternate reading of his own subject, isn't something the historical record settles clearly. It does suggest, though, that Doré himself may have been turning the same idea over more than once, unsatisfied with a single final statement. Why it still holds a tension part of the painting's staying power is technical. Doré was, whatever the salon critics said, an extraordinary draftsman, and it shows in the anatomy of grief here, the exact angle of a bowed head, the particular slackness of a body that stopped holding itself up. That kind of observed, physical accuracy is hard to fake, and it's part of why the emotional hit lands, even on viewers who know nothing about 19th century French circus culture. Part of it is also structural. The painting withholds just enough information to keep functioning as a question rather than a statement. We're given a devastating outcome and almost no reliable narrative about how we got there. Is the harlequin the father, a fellow performer, or something more symbolic? Was the accident really an accident, Or does the painting quietly accuse the parents of choosing profit over their child's safety? The way Doré's own words to that interviewer suggest he believed, the picture supplies the emotional certainty of tragedy while keeping the facts of it just out of reach. And maybe that's the real reason it keeps resurfacing online, generation after generation of viewers rediscovering it. It isn't a puzzle with a hidden solution waiting to be cracked. It's a scene built to be argued about, which is in its own way exactly the kind of theatre Doré spent his whole career fascinated by. A closing thought: Doré never left behind a letter explaining every card, every animal, every choice of colour in this canvas. What we have instead is one interview, one blunt statement about a dying child, and two hardened parents who discovered, too late, that they loved him, and a painting that has been reinterpreted by nearly everyone who's stood in front of it since. Maybe that absence of explanation isn't a gap in the historical record, so much as the point. Some paintings tell you exactly what to think. This one just shows you the aftermath and waits to see what you bring to it. What do you see when you look at it? An accident? An accusation? Or something closer to a modern pietà staged under a circus tent?